Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. They had taken it for a mere formality. A harmless altercation, a scene quickly forgotten between hurried customers and dull waiters. They didn't know that day, in the parking lot of the Lincoln Diner, a tiny mistake would ignite a fuse beneath the polished veneer of their lives. They didn't know that the man they had humiliated, a veteran with a calm gaze, now unassuming and discreet, would, as he stood up, hold in his hands the key that would unlock the doors to their downfall. Michael Turner, the owner of the local mall, had huddled his customers with a condescending tone. Sarah Lawson, the public relations director, had smiled a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Tom Bennett, the influential lawyer, had laid his hand on them more than was appropriate. They laughed, seeing their actions as nothing more than a display of social dominance, a reminder of who was in charge in their neighborhood. But this veteran, Jim Wallace, bore more than just physical scars. He retained a sharp memory, principles, and allies they hadn't known existed. What they had thought was a trivial incident would, in fact, awaken an old story, debts, compromises, buried evidence, and transform humiliation into a revelation that would strip them of everything. This story recounts the slow downfall of those who believed themselves untouchable, the quiet strength of a man society had tried to forget, and how truth, when it finds a face, always ends up demanding redress. This is the story of the humiliation that was meant to be just another scene, and that became the storm that swept everything away. Michael Turner loved numbers. Contracts, growth curves, the marble plaques in the lobbies of his buildings, everything was calculable. When he looked at his city from his office balcony, he saw a chessboard where every building, every business had its place and its role. He saw himself as king. Sarah Lawson saw the image, brochures, photos, campaigns. She let nothing tarnish its brilliance. Tom Bennett saw the law as a malleable instrument, a tongue to persuade and a hammer to finish. The Lincoln Diner was one of those places Michael considered merely decorative, a comfortable bistro where his clients grabbed coffee between appointments. That morning, a parking space dispute, a misunderstanding with the security guard, and James Wallace, leaning on his walker, was accosted by a young employee who made a cutting remark. James responded with dignity. The argument escalated. Michael intervened, Sarah watched, Tom sneered. Without any of them realizing what they were doing, they pushed him, humiliated his name, his past. They made a spectacle of him. After the scene, Sarah's phone beeped. An email that made her smile, then she returned to her orderly world. Tom went to the courthouse, almost moved to still be in an arena. Michael got into his official car, mentally rehearsing the day's schedule. Neither of them saw James's trembling hand as he tucked away his hat. Neither of them heard the whisper James jotted down in a notebook: "Nothing is lost. Nothing is forgotten." This notebook contained 30 years of memories, names, dates, transactions. Before reaching the Lincoln Diner, James had been a logistics officer, then an investigator for internal commissions. He knew people, facts, accounts, evidence. Gray figures, boards of directors, seemingly clean contracts that concealed threads of darkness. And amidst these files, an annotated sheet mentioned the Sequoia Project, a financial scheme that had involved Michael Turner, with ramifications reaching as far as Tom Bennett. James had never spoken. He observed. He took notes. Perhaps he was waiting for the moment when the tide would turn. James's notebook wasn't a collection of anecdotes, it was a treasure trove. Every name was linked to a date, a place, a receipt. The Sequoia Project had once been an ambitious undertaking, an urban renewal program that promised jobs and grandeur. Public money had been mixed with private funds. Some parts were missing. Envelopes had changed hands. Little by little, the city had grown, and so had the men who had shaped it, on shaky foundations. James wasn't naive. He knew that making a case public without irrefutable proof would only bury him deeper. But the humiliation he suffered that day rekindled something within him, not a thirst for personal revenge, but a desire to ensure that those who had perpetrated the injustice could no longer hide behind their titles. He arranged to meet with a former classmate, Emily Carter, an independent investigative journalist known for her tenacious investigations and her refusal to bow to local power. Emily listened to James. She touched the notebook, read the pages. She grasped the scope. Where James had a date, she saw an angle for investigation. Where he read a name, she saw a network. Her questions brought connections to light: a rigged market, sold permits, audits doctored by a firm linked to Tom Bennett. Emily agreed to dig deeper, but with a warning: you don't take on powerful people with impressions. You need documents, witnesses, bank records. James agreed. He knew a man, Hector Morales, a former accountant turned janitor, who had kept paper copies for fear of being discovered. Hector remembered. They paid me to keep quiet, he murmured. But he had kept duplicates, just in case. The grains of sand were starting to clog the gears. Meanwhile, the day went on for the three humiliators. Michael signed a funding agreement, Sarah finalized a campaign, and Tom received a favorable ruling. Little did they know that, behind these pages, a discreet hand was assembling the pieces of a puzzle that would change their destinies. Emily published a concise, precise article that pointed out irregularities in the Sequoia project. Readers read it, some were annoyed, others noticed nothing. But a reaction cannot remain localized forever. The news spread. A financial investigator was hired. The accounts were scrutinized. The first clues pointed to suspicious transfers to an account linked to a shell company. Michael Turner's name began to appear in documents he hadn't even known existed. Michael felt the pressure. At first, he refused to believe it. Then, when an independent auditor sent a letter requesting documents, he consulted Tom. Tom, initially trusting, found irregularities in the contracts he himself had signed to formalize certain transactions. Fear gave way to haste. Sarah, who had built her image on control, sensed the cracks in her facade. She tried to defuse the situation publicly, issuing saccharine statements and arranging interviews where, all smiles, she downplayed the situation. But the public machine had begun to turn against her. Forgotten witnesses awoke. Encouraged, Hector Morales handed Emily a sealed box. Inside were photocopies, receipts, and signed letters. Each item seemed innocuous on its own. Together, they formed a web. Emily had some of the documents analyzed by a firm of experts. The dates matched. The signatures on a few checks lacked authenticity. Tom, who thought he could buy silence, felt the prison closing in. Michael's pride turned to a simmering rage. He called contacts, threatened, and tried to pressure the journalist. Some of his allies hesitated. Power is never a completely monolithic block, it rests on support. And when support wavers, ruin begins with invisible cracks. James observed. He didn't display any triumphant enthusiasm. He knew that justice is slow, that it often bites at the calves before seizing the throat. But he remained convinced that every document, every witness, offered a chance to redress an injustice greater than his own humiliation. The national media picked up the story. The affair acquired a name, Sequoia Gate. Investors withdrew their pledges. Banks backed out. Michael Turner saw buildings investigated, contracts suspended, and partners withdraw. His legal empire crumbled. Tom Bennett had the audacity to play his usual card: challenge, bribe, and tie the debate to technicalities, but the mounting evidence rendered rhetoric ineffective. Federal authorities opened a case. Searches were carried out. Sarah was forced to resign from the Urban Development Committee, her reputation tarnished by leaked emails that revealed cynicism and contempt. The public was outraged, not only by the financial misappropriation, but by the moral dissonance. These local leaders who had ridiculed an ordinary man were revealed to be complicit in a system that weakened precisely the communities they claimed to serve. Social media amplified the outrage. Protesters gathered outside the Lincoln Diner, veterans united in James's name, not to celebrate revenge, but to demand transparency and redress for all those left behind. The downfall took an administrative and symbolic form: dismissals, prosecutions, asset confiscations. Michael saw his accounts frozen. Tom received a summons, Sarah lost her social standing and access to the circles she relied on. But the most devastating sanction was more subtle, the betrayal revealed to their own people. Business partners felt duped. Friends distanced themselves. The life they had built, contracts, friendships, status, was crumbling not only under the visible hand of the law, but also through the even harsher blow of social rejection. James, however, wasn't jubilant. He felt a kind of somber relief, like when a painful bandage is ripped off. Things wouldn't go back to the way they were, neither for the powerful nor for those who had been crushed. And amidst the paperwork and the hearings, James revisited his past, camaraderie, wounds, broken promises. He understood that healing was a collective process. In court, the truth had to be brought to light. Witnesses came forward. Hector Morales spoke, a former accountant from a partner firm agreed to cooperate, and a former executive admitted to making payments to keep his job. Tom tried maneuvering, delaying, discrediting, but the sheer volume of documents and testimonies formed a mosaic too dense to be dismantled by the usual rhetoric. The public hearings were painful. Michael, accustomed to composure, broke down in private. Sarah offered a measured, cold, public apology. It rang hollow. Their forced, and belated, humility did nothing to erase the wounds inflicted on the veteran or the anger of a betrayed community. Yet the event also brought unexpected things. A reparations commission was proposed, led by independent members, to reallocate funds to veterans' reintegration programs and community projects. James, in a newfound humility, was invited to serve as a moral advisor. He accepted not out of a desire for honor but because he did not want the truth exploited for other private gain. Legal sanctions came, fines, restitution, light sentences for some accomplices, but perhaps the most just punishment was the shift in human relationships. Faces turned away, names became associated with betrayal. Michael and Tom's children and partners questioned their choices. The estates had crumbled, and with them, the certainty of unassailable power. For James, the victory was not complete. He had obtained tangible reparations, but he had also stirred up darker memories and forced a city to confront its own moral fragility. He understood that justice is not limited to the downfall of the powerful. It also requires rebuilding broken bonds, listening to the downtrodden, and maintaining constant vigilance. In the years that followed, the city changed. The Sequoia program was redesigned, transparent audits, citizen committees, accessible public accounts. Sarah left, volunteered with support groups, and slowly found a path from reputation to healing. Tom, scarred by his experiences, argued for reform of the practices that had once served him. The courtroom now regarded him with suspicion, but also sometimes with a demand for newfound honesty. Michael, humiliated even in his actions, sold property, supported transparency initiatives, and learned, the hard way, the difference between leading and crushing. James became a modest but respected figure. He wrote less in his journal and spent more time listening. He started a small organization to help veterans transition to civilian life, vocational training, counseling, and administrative support. He shunned the limelight, he sought to heal rather than triumph. When the memorial plaque was finally installed at the Lincoln Diner, many voices spoke his name not as that of a man seeking revenge, but as that of a citizen who, out of dignity, had reminded his community of the cost of humiliating another human being. The final scene depicts a simple dinner, James surrounded by old friends, Emily, Hector, men and women who had chosen to transform hurt into initiative. Occasionally, an old scar tugged at his arm, a reminder of a distant field. He would raise his glass and say simply, "You can't buy back the past, but you can choose how to walk from here." The faces around the table smiled, not with triumphant smiles, but with smiles that have weathered the storm and opt for healing. The story of James Wallace and those who humiliated him is a story of upheaval. On one side, the presumption of impunity built on prestige and money. On the other, the simple dignity of a man whom society had almost forgotten. It reminds us that humiliation is never anecdotal. It leaves its mark, its traces, and demands a response, sometimes legal, sometimes moral, often a laborious one. The powerful lost what they had built not through a flash of personal vengeance, but because their actions had weakened a social contract. James did not seek destruction for its own sake, he chose transparency and repair. and the imperfect city learned that it is better to listen than to laugh.